It began on a quiet afternoon in New York City, inside a cafe where the wealthy paid for silence. A black waitress raised her hands and spoke through sign language, 5 seconds that stopped the entire room. No one knew that single gesture would pull her into a world where money could buy everything except trust. From a misunderstood glance to a viral photo to a night where diamonds became an accusation, her life and a billionaire's would collide forever. This is a story of prejudice, betrayal, redemption, and the power of kindness, where silence spoke louder than words. In the late afternoon hush of the quiet corner cafe, the world outside hummed with sirens and ambition. But inside, time moved slow enough to hear a heart break. Amara Johnson wiped down the counter, her brown hands steady, even when her heart wasn't. The cafe was the kind of place where silence was sold by the cup. White marble tables, smooth jazz bleeding softly from invisible speakers, and customers who measured worth by the weight of their watches. She was the only black waitress there. She knew it every time a customer's eyes flickered across her face before sliding away, polite but distant, as if kindness was a limited resource. "Table 6 needs another refill," her manager, Carl, murmured from behind the espresso machine. He was the kind of man who smiled for customers and scowled for staff. "And keep your voice down when you talk to them, yeah? People come here for quiet, not chatter." "Yes, sir," Amara said, though she hadn't raised her voice once that day. Her tone was smooth, practiced, the same voice she used when the rent was late or when her brother called in the middle of the night, shaking from another nightmare that smelled like smoke and sand. She poured the coffee, the dark swirl catching a thin ribbon of sunlight through the window. Outside, autumn leaves scraped along the sidewalk, the city restless even when she wasn't. Her reflection in the polished counter looked older than 27. There were lines of fatigue under her eyes and the quiet kind of strength that didn't show unless you looked close. At 4:12, the bell above the door chimed. The room shifted. Conversations hushed. Even the barista froze mid-pour. Carl straightened his tie so fast it looked like he'd rehearsed it. Richard Ward had arrived. Amara knew his face before Carl even whispered his name. It was the kind of face that appeared on magazine covers and news tickers, beside headlines about skyscrapers and stock prices. Richard Ward, the real estate magnate who rebuilt half of Manhattan after the last recession and pushed thousands of low-income families out in the process. He carried his wealth like armor, tailored and silent. Beside him was his wife, Helen Ward, elegant in cream wool, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes soft and distant. Helen didn't speak. She didn't even seem to hear the hush that followed them to their table. Her gaze stayed fixed on the window, on the faint reflection of her husband's profile. Carl practically jogged to greet them. "Mr. Ward, Mrs. Ward, what an honor," he said, his voice turning syrupy. "Your usual table?" Richard gave a curt nod. "Yes." Carl led them to the corner table by the window, the one reserved for people who could buy the building if they wanted. Amara stayed by the counter, gripping the coffee pot, watching as Carl leaned too close to Helen, speaking loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Would you like some water, ma'am?" he said, over-enunciating each word. "Water?" Helen didn't react. She just blinked, her jaw tightening slightly. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Amara knew that look. Her mother used to wear it when people shouted slowly at her, thinking volume could replace understanding. Richard's expression stiffened. "She can't hear you, Carl," he said flatly. "Just bring the water." "Yes, sir, of course," Carl stammered, retreating toward the counter, his face burning. Amara set the coffee pot down. Something inside her twisted, not pity exactly, but recognition. That loneliness, that small humiliation of being treated like a problem to solve instead of a person. It was a language she spoke fluently. Carl caught her staring. "What are you waiting for? Take them the water," he hissed. "And don't say anything extra. Just pour and leave." "Got it?" She nodded. Her fingers tightened around the tray as she walked toward the corner table. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. Every step felt heavier than it should have. Helen looked up as Amara approached, her eyes clear but distant, like she was watching the world through glass. Amara set the water down gently, then hesitated. She could feel Richard's gaze on her, sharp and assessing. "Will there be anything else?" she asked softly. Richard shook his head, already turning back to his phone. Amara's chest tightened. She wanted to walk away, to keep her job, to keep her silence. But then Helen's eyes flickered toward her again, curious, cautious, like a candle behind frosted glass. Amara took a breath. Her hands moved before her fear could stop them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ward." The signs were smooth, deliberate, the language of her childhood home. Her mother's hands had shaped those same gestures years ago in a cramped apartment that smelled like soap and worry. Helen blinked. Then, slowly, her expression changed. Her shoulders straightened. Her lips trembled into something almost forgotten, a smile. Her hands rose, shaky at first, then graceful. You speak my language?" The room went still. Even the espresso machine seemed to hush. Richard looked up, confusion flickering into surprise. For a long second, he said nothing. Helen's fingers moved again, more certain this time. Her gestures flowed like music, only she and Amara could hear. Amara signed back, smiling. "I learned from my mother. She was deaf too. She said silence isn't emptiness, it's another kind of sound." Helen's eyes glistened. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming a single word. "Thank you." Richard's phone slipped from his hand onto the table with a soft clatter. He was staring, unguarded, the cold precision in his features cracking just enough to show the man beneath the empire. Carl stood frozen near the counter, mouth slightly open. A couple at the next table exchanged bewildered glances. No one spoke. The only sound was the slow rhythm of Helen's breath and the faint hum of city life beyond the window. Amara lowered her hands, bowed her head politely, and turned to leave. But before she could take a step, Richard's voice stopped her. "What's your name?" She turned. "Amara, sir. Amara Johnson." He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson." Carl scurried over as soon as she reached the counter, whispering furiously. "What the hell was that? You want to get fired? You don't talk to guests unless spoken to." "She spoke to me," Amara said simply, her voice steady. "Just not the way you understand." Carl stared at her, at a loss for words. For the first time that day, Amara didn't look away. Later, when she left the cafe, the city lights had started to bloom across the skyline. She walked toward the subway, her apron folded neatly in her bag, the cool air brushing against her skin like a secret. For once, she didn't feel invisible. Somewhere behind her, in that quiet cafe on Fifth Avenue, a powerful man sat beside his wife and wondered why a stranger's hands had made her smile when all his money never could. 2 days after the strange, silent exchange at the cafe, Amara was back behind the counter, polishing the same coffee cups that had been polished 100 times before. The moment with Mrs. Ward had lingered like a ghost, too fragile to talk about, too powerful to forget. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that smile, hesitant, trembling, real. It had been the kind of smile that carried a lifetime of quiet inside it. "Hey, superstar," Carl muttered as he passed, snapping her out of the thought. "You've got a visitor." Amara turned, frowning. A tall man in a dark suit stood by the door. He didn't look like the regulars. His expression was blank, but his eyes were the kind that weighed people, measured them. "Miss Johnson?" he asked. "Yes?" "Mr. Ward would like to speak with you, if you have a moment." Her stomach dropped. "Mr. Ward?" she repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it less impossible. The man nodded once. "He'll send a car for you this afternoon if you're available." Carl stepped in before she could answer. "She's working." "I'll take it," Amara said quickly, surprising herself as much as anyone else. The man handed her a small card with the embossed logo of Ward Enterprises and left without another word. Carl crossed his arms. "You'd better not be quitting for some publicity stunt. You know guys like that. They throw money at something for the story, then forget your name next week." Amara pocketed the card. "It's not about money," she said softly. "It's about respect." That afternoon, she rode in silence as the black car wound its way out of Manhattan, past the noise, into a stretch of private road lined with trees that looked too symmetrical to be real. The driver said nothing. The air smelled of rain and pine when they reached the Ward estate, a modern mansion with glass walls and manicured perfection. It felt less like a home and more like a museum that someone forgot to leave. The butler, a rigid man with silver hair, opened the door. "Mr. Ward is expecting you," he said, leading her down a long hallway of polished stone and portraits. The only sound was her own footsteps, the faint echo of rubber soles on marble. Richard Ward was in the library, standing beside a window that overlooked an expanse of gardens. He turned when she entered. The light caught the sharp angles of his face, softening them just enough to make him human. "Miss Johnson," he said, "thank you for coming." She nodded, her palms damp. "You didn't give me much choice, sir. Your man was very persuasive." He almost smiled. "He's good at that." He gestured toward the sofa. "Please sit." Helen Ward sat there already, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When she saw Amara, her whole face lit up. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like watching sunlight break through fog. She signed quickly. "You came." Amara smiled back, answering in kind. "Of course, it's good to see you again." Richard watched, fascinated and slightly uneasy. "She's been asking about you since that day," he said. "You made quite an impression." Helen touched her husband's sleeve, signing something with gentle insistence. Richard nodded and looked back at Amara. "My wife would like you to assist her for a short period, 2 weeks, leading up to our foundation's charity gala. She needs someone who can communicate, and she trusts you." Amara blinked. "Me? I'm just a waitress, Mr. Ward." "You're more than that," he said quietly. "You made her smile. I haven't seen that in years." The compliment landed somewhere deep inside her, equal parts warmth and disbelief. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Helen signed, her eyes pleading. Amara hesitated. 2 weeks at this house, surrounded by people who looked at her the way Carl did, or worse. And yet there was Malik. The overdue bills, the medication, the constant balancing act of survival. She could already hear his voice on the phone. "Don't do anything stupid for me, sis." She drew a breath. "What would I have to do?" "Be her interpreter," Richard said. "Her companion if needed. She's hosting several meetings before the event. Fittings, luncheons, planning sessions. It's exhausting for her. You be compensated fairly." "How fairly?" $25,000 for 2 weeks. Amara stared. The number didn't feel real. It wasn't just money. It was freedom, a crack of light in a life that had been dim for too long. But she couldn't let him see that. "That's generous." "It's not charity," Richard said, catching her hesitation. "It's payment for your time. You'd start tomorrow." She nodded slowly. "All right." When she left the estate, the sun was setting over the gardens, painting everything gold and unreal. She should have felt elated, but something inside her whispered caution. People like Richard Ward didn't hand out lifelines. They tested how far others would reach for them. That night, she called Malik. His voice was rough, low from years of cigarettes and sleeplessness. "You sure about this?" he asked. "It's 2 weeks," she said. "Just sign language, that's all." "Rich white folks don't invite you over for nothing, Mara. Don't let them make you feel small." "I won't," she promised, though part of her wasn't sure. The next morning, a black sedan waited outside her apartment. She wore her best blouse, pressed until it held a faint smell of starch and hope. The driver nodded respectfully, called her Miss Johnson, and opened the door like she was someone important. When they reached the mansion again, a different woman greeted her. Thin, blonde, dressed in a sharp gray suit. Her smile was tight enough to cut glass. "Evelyn Gray," she said, "head of communications for Ward Enterprises." Amara shook her hand. Evelyn's grip was soft but cold. "You'll be assisting Mrs. Ward," she continued. "Please remember, this is a high-profile household. Privacy is paramount." And she paused, giving Amara a long, deliberate glance. "Image matters." Amara met her gaze evenly. "I understand. I hope you do," Evelyn said, the smile never reaching her eyes. Inside, Helen waited in a sunlit sitting room, surrounded by books and orchids. She looked up as Amara entered, her expression transforming again into that quiet joy. She signed, "Welcome home." Amara laughed softly. "I'm just visiting." Helen shook her head. "Then I hope you stay longer than most visitors." The moment felt small and sacred, as if two worlds had brushed against each other and found they fit. Outside the room, Evelyn watched through the glass wall, her reflection merging with theirs like a shadow that didn't belong. By evening, Amara stood at the window of the guest room they'd prepared for her. From there, she could see the ocean, wide and dark, stretching beyond the manicured lawns. Somewhere in that vast silence, she felt the shape of something new forming, possibility or danger. She couldn't tell which. She touched her fingers together, an old habit from childhood when words felt too heavy to carry. The house behind her murmured with distant voices, the language of power and wealth. She didn't belong here. She knew that. But as the lights dimmed and the ocean kept breathing beyond the glass, she also knew this. For the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she needed to be. The first morning began with a kind of quiet Amara wasn't used to, the expensive kind, heavy and deliberate. Even the air in the Ward mansion felt disciplined, like it had been trained not to make a sound. A housekeeper named Maria showed her to the breakfast room where Helen was already seated, sipping tea, her hair pinned perfectly. Richard sat across from her, reading the financial section of the Times, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he said without looking up. "Good morning, sir," she answered, setting her bag down beside the chair. Helen gestured toward. Helen smiled and began signing, her hands moving with a grace that belied her age. "Did you sleep well? The room suits you?" Amara signed back. "It's beautiful, thank you. I still feel like I might break something if I breathe too hard." Helen laughed silently, the corners of her eyes softening. Richard looked up, studying the exchange like a man watching two people share a language he didn't believe existed. He cleared his throat. "You'll be accompanying my wife today. There's a luncheon downtown with the board of the foundation. They'll expect introductions. Keep things professional." "Of course," Amara said. Maria entered with a tray of fruit, eyeing Amara curiously before setting it down. There was something in her look, pity maybe, or warning. The staff didn't speak to Amara much, but she could feel their stares follow her through every hallway, as if her presence was a question no one had answered yet. After breakfast, Helen led Amara to the solarium, a room flooded with sunlight and filled with orchids. "I come here to listen," Helen signed. "To what?" "The light," she replied with a faint smile. Amara helped her review the notes for the luncheon, translating documents and preparing cue cards written in large, clear letters. Helen moved her fingers swiftly as she spoke, and Amara followed easily, their rhythm smooth, comfortable. When Richard appeared at the doorway later, the sight of them startled him. Helen's eyes were alive, her hands animated, her posture straight. It had been years since she'd looked like that. "I'll have the car ready in an hour," he said. "Try not to exhaust her." Helen raised an eyebrow and signed. "You worry too much." Amara translated, her voice gentle but teasing. "She says you worry too much." Richard's mouth twitched into something like a smile. "That's nothing new." The drive to the city was silent, except for the low hum of the tires on the highway. Helen gazed out the window, her reflection framed against the glass, while Richard scrolled through emails on his phone. Amara sat opposite them, her palms sweating despite the air conditioning. The closer they got to Manhattan, the smaller she felt. At the hotel ballroom, photographers waited outside, their flashes bursting like fireworks. Amara stayed a few steps behind Helen as they entered. The luncheon was crowded, men in suits, women in pearls, the chatter of wealth filling every inch of the room. Evelyn Gray appeared as if conjured from smoke. "Mrs. Ward," she said with that perfect rehearsed smile. "You look stunning as always, and Miss Johnson, so glad you could join us." Her tone made it sound like she meant the opposite. "Thank you," Amara said evenly. Evelyn leaned closer. "A word of advice, dear. These people notice everything. One wrong move and they'll chew you up. Smile when they look. Stay quiet when they don't." Amara's jaw tightened. "I'll be fine." "Oh, I'm sure you will," Evelyn murmured, already turning away. During the luncheon, Amara stood slightly behind Helen, translating as needed, her voice calm, her presence unobtrusive. She signed when Helen wanted to speak, her hands moving like water. For the first time in years, Helen contributed to a discussion instead of sitting in silence. Afterward, a board member named Mr. Leland approached Richard, smiling too wide. "Your wife's interpreter. She's remarkable. Didn't expect that kind of polish from." He trailed off, his eyes flicking toward Amara. "From what exactly?" Richard asked quietly. The man flushed. "From someone outside the usual circles." Richard's stare hardened. "Talent doesn't have circles, Mr. Leland. It has effort." When they left the hotel, the city's noise rushed in, a kind of chaos Amara could finally breathe in. Helen reached for her hand, signing quickly. "You did beautifully. They saw me again. They heard me because of you." Amara smiled, swallowing the lump in her throat. "They heard you because you spoke." She signed back. That evening, dinner at the mansion felt lighter. Helen was radiant, animated, gesturing stories about her students from before the accident. Richard listened, half in awe, half in disbelief. When Amara translated Helen's teasing about his early business suits being too shiny, he actually laughed. The sound startled everyone, including himself. After the meal, Helen excused herself for a bath, leaving Amara and Richard alone at the long table. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hesitated, then poured one for her too. "You've done more for her in 2 days than an army of doctors in 10 years, he said. Amara accepted the glass, her fingers brushing the cool crystal. "Maybe it's not medicine she needed," she said quietly. "Maybe she just needed someone who speaks her language." He looked at her, really looked this time. "And what about you, Miss Johnson? Who speaks yours?" She almost smiled. "I'm still figuring that out." For a moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was gentle, human. Then the sound of heels clicked against the marble. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, holding a folder. "Richard, we need to finalize the press list for the gala." Her gaze flicked to Amara, cool and assessing. "You can go now, Miss Johnson. We'll take it from here." Amara nodded, setting the glass down untouched. "Good night, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Ward." As she walked down the hall toward the guest wing, the echo of their voices faded behind her. Through the glass walls, the ocean shimmered under the moonlight. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the tide shifting, something too big to name, too quiet to ignore. She didn't see Evelyn linger behind after she left, nor the way the woman's smile thinned when Richard said, "She's staying through the gala. Make the arrangements." Evelyn's manicured nails tapped once against the folder, slow and deliberate, before she replied, "Of course." That night in her room, Amara called Malik again. He was watching an old movie, his voice sleepy. "How's the palace, sis?" "Too clean," she said, smiling faintly. "You ever been in a place so quiet it feels like it's listening?" "Sounds creepy." "It kind of is," she admitted. "But maybe not all bad." He grunted. "Don't let him change you, Amara." "I won't," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure anymore. When she hung up, she looked out the window again. Below, the ocean whispered against the rocks, constant, patient, unknowable. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the city kept moving, loud and indifferent. Here, in this silent house of strangers, she was beginning to realize how easily kindness could turn into something else, something dangerous, when people started to pay attention. Morning light poured through the high glass windows of the Ward mansion, soft and gold, catching on the dust motes that drifted like secrets in the air. Amara had been awake since dawn, her body still not used to the stillness of this place. At home, the world woke her, buses screeching, neighbors arguing, Malik's restless pacing in the next room. Here, the silence pressed in, too polite to be real. She dressed quietly and made her way down to the solarium, where Helen sat among the orchids, their petals gleaming wet with dew. Helen looked up, her expression brightening. "You're early," she signed. Amara smiled. "Couldn't sleep. Thought maybe we could go over the gala schedule again." Helen gestured for her to sit. They spent the next hour reviewing names, donors, photographs, Helen pausing often to sign a memory about each person. Small, intimate details that no press release could hold. "This one collects art but doesn't understand any of it," she teased. "And this woman, she always pretends to care about hearing loss until the cameras are gone." Amara laughed, fingers moving with quick confidence. "You've got them all figured out." Helen's gaze softened. "Money doesn't make people complicated, Amara. It makes them louder." Silence. Silence is where you find truth. Before Amara could respond, footsteps echoed down the marble hall. Richard appeared, jacket slung over one arm, his expression distracted. "Morning," he said, glancing between them. "You two have been at it early." Helen signed something sharp and amused. Amara hesitated, then translated. "She says you work too much and smile too little." Richard gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "She's not wrong." He turned to Amara. "If you have a moment after breakfast, there's something I'd like to show you. You've been helping with the foundation's correspondence. There's a file I think you'll find interesting." When he left, Helen arched an eyebrow. "Be careful," she signed. "Men who want to show you files usually want to show you something else." Amara chuckled, embarrassed, but her stomach fluttered all the same. Later that morning, she met Richard in his study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and paper, lined with books that looked more decorative than read. He motioned for her to sit, then opened a sleek folder. "These are drafts for our community redevelopment projects," he explained. Helen used to oversee them before her accident. I've tried to continue in her name. Amara skimmed the pages, statistical reports, property transfers, zoning permits. But one line caught her attention. Southbrook Housing Redevelopment, Phase 3 clearance completed. Southbrook. She knew that name. Her aunt had lived there before the neighborhood vanished overnight, bulldozed for luxury condos. She looked up slowly. This project, Southbrook, wasn't that a public housing area? Richard frowned slightly. It was a high-crime district with unsafe conditions. We provided relocation assistance. Relocation, she repeated, her voice tightening. You mean eviction? He stiffened. I don't expect you to understand the business side, Miss Johnson. Her chest burned. Maybe not the business side, but I understand what happens when people lose their homes. My aunt was one of them. His eyes flickered, surprise, maybe guilt, but his tone stayed even. Then I'm sorry she was affected. But progress always costs someone something. She rose, unable to hold his gaze. That's not progress, Mr. Ward. That's just profit with better lighting. There was silence between them, long enough for her pulse to calm. Then he said, quieter, "You're the first person who said that to my face. I guess no one else wanted to lose their job." When she left the study, her hands were shaking. She walked out into the gardens to breathe, the air cold and sharp against her skin. Helen found her there an hour later, carrying a blanket over her shoulders. She signed gently. He can be difficult, but he listens when someone speaks from truth. Amara signed back. He listens to you. Helen smiled sadly. He used to, when I could speak his language. She reached out, her fingertips brushing Amara's wrist. Now you speak it for me. That frightens him. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the gardeners trim the rose bushes. From somewhere in the house, the faint sound of a piano drifted out, hesitant notes, searching for rhythm. Helen's eyes lit up. He hasn't played since before the accident, she signed. Amara listened to the melody, uneven but sincere. Maybe he's remembering something, she said softly. That afternoon, Evelyn appeared at the solarium door, carrying a stack of envelopes and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Ward asked me to drop off tomorrow's itinerary, she said smoothly, handing it to Amara instead of Helen. You'll need to accompany Mrs. Ward to the charity committee meeting at 2. Dress appropriately. It's a very visible crowd. Amara nodded, but Evelyn didn't move. She tilted her head slightly, lowering her voice. You're adapting quickly here. That can be dangerous. Dangerous how? Evelyn smiled thinly. People get comfortable. They start thinking they belong. Then they forget where they came from. That never ends well. Amara met her gaze evenly. Maybe I'm not the one who's forgotten where she came from. Evelyn's smile faltered for a heartbeat before returning. Careful, Miss Johnson. This house eats people alive when they start to matter. She turned and walked away, heels clicking like a metronome. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. The house creaked with the wind off the ocean, and somewhere downstairs a clock ticked too loudly. She got up, restless, and wandered toward the library, drawn by the dim glow under the door. Inside, Richard sat alone, staring at a photograph of him and Helen from years ago. A gala, both of them laughing, the world still intact. He didn't notice Amara at first. When he finally looked up, his expression was unguarded, almost human. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Too quiet, she said honestly. He gestured to the piano in the corner. It used to help, the quiet. She hesitated. You were playing earlier. He smiled faintly. Badly. Helen loved when I played, even when I hit the wrong keys, said it made me sound less like a machine. Amara stepped closer, studying the framed photo on the piano. She misses you, she said softly. Not your money, not your empire, just you. He stared at her, his jaw tightening. And what makes you think you understand my wife? I don't, she said, but I understand loneliness. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, so do I. When she returned to her room, the ocean was still roaring beyond the cliffs, the moonlight cutting pale lines across the floor. She sat on the edge of her bed, heart heavy with thoughts she couldn't name. Somewhere beneath this mansion's marble calm, there was tension, old guilt, quiet sorrow, and something darker, waiting for the right silence to rise through. Before turning off the lamp, she picked up her phone and texted Malik. You ever get the feeling you're standing in someone else's storm? A minute later, his reply came. Then keep your umbrella ready, sis. Rich folks don't like to get wet. She smiled faintly at the screen. But the unease lingered. The mansion had started to feel less like a home and more like a story that didn't know how to end. And she was afraid she just stepped into the middle of its unfinished sentence. By the time the sun rose over the Hamptons, the Ward mansion was already buzzing. Florists, decorators, and catering crews streamed through the hallways, preparing for the press preview ahead of the gala. Amara moved quietly through the commotion, guiding Helen toward the atrium for a fitting. The older woman was radiant in soft blue silk, her smile framed by a grace that no designer could replicate. When Helen signed, her movements were fluid, full of life again. Amara found herself smiling back, though something about the energy in the house felt different, charged like air before a storm. Evelyn Gray appeared mid-morning, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking across the marble like punctuation marks. "Richard wants the media briefing notes by noon," she said briskly, though her gaze landed on Amara before drifting back to Helen. "And Mrs. Ward, the photographer will need a few shots of you and your interpreter for the article. The human interest angle." Helen tilted her head, signing, "I'm not a prop." Amara translated, her tone even. Evelyn's expression didn't flicker. "Of course not, but this event is about visibility. People love a story." Amara could feel Helen's displeasure as the older woman signed sharply, then let them see truth, not performance. Evelyn forced a polite smile. "Truth photographs best in good lighting." She turned on her heel and left, her perfume lingering like smoke. After the fitting, Helen retreated to the solarium for tea, while Amara stayed behind to help the staff clear the racks of gowns. She was folding a shawl when she heard soft laughter behind her. Two of the younger maids were huddled near the doorway, whispering. "She's the one from the video," one murmured. "The waitress who made the old lady smile." "The one on that blog? Yeah, people were saying it was staged. A PR thing." Amara pretended not to hear, though her chest tightened. She'd seen the clip online weeks ago, a grainy recording of that moment at the cafe, her hands moving in quiet conversation while the billionaire's wife lit up with joy. Millions of views, thousands of comments, most of them harmless. But some were cruel. She's milking sympathy, playing the race card for clout. Look at her smile. She knows exactly what she's doing. She'd learned to stop reading them. But the words still found ways to echo. That afternoon, the first guests arrived for the press luncheon. Investors, charity heads, a few socialites. Amara stood beside Helen near the entrance, translating greetings with practiced calm. Richard hovered nearby, formal but attentive. The cameras flashed, journalists asked questions, and Helen answered through Amara's hands, every motion precise. The crowd was drawn in, by the beauty of it or the novelty, she couldn't tell. Then Evelyn stepped forward with a practiced grin. "Everyone, let's give a hand to the woman who made this event possible," she said, her tone honeyed. "Without Miss Johnson, Mrs. Ward wouldn't be able to share her story today." There was polite applause. Someone called out, "Is it true she used to work at a coffee shop?" Laughter rippled softly through the crowd. Amara felt heat crawl up her neck, but Helen squeezed her hand and signed, "Stand tall." Afterward, while the guests mingled, Amara escaped to the garden to breathe. She sat on a bench beneath a magnolia tree, the scent heavy in the air. For a while, she just let the quiet settle. That's when she heard voices nearby, low, sharp. "She's getting too comfortable," Evelyn was saying. Her voice carried the silky danger of someone who never raised it. "He's spending too much time watching them." Richard's voice followed, quieter but firm. "You're reading too much into it." "Am I? You've known me long enough to trust my instincts. This girl, she's smart, too smart. You don't know her motives." Amara froze. Through the leaves, she could see them standing near the terrace. Evelyn in her immaculate suit, Richard with his hands in his pockets, brow furrowed. "She's helping Helen," he said finally. Evelyn stepped closer. "Or helping herself. Don't tell me you haven't noticed how she looks at you." He gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's ridiculous." "Is it? Because I saw you look back." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Richard's voice came, cold as glass. "Enough, Evelyn." She smiled thinly. "Of course." When they left, Amara sat there, unmoving. Shame, confusion, and anger tangled inside her until she could barely breathe. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the accusation or the flicker of truth in Evelyn's tone. Because somewhere beneath her professionalism, she had started to care. That evening, as the house grew quiet again, Amara retreated to her room, but the feeling of unease wouldn't fade. She opened her phone and scrolled absent-mindedly through the news feed until a notification froze her hand. Billionaire's wife's interpreter rumored to be more than an employee. Her own face stared back at her from the thumbnail, taken that afternoon. Richard looking at her mid-translation, the camera catching a moment that looked far too intimate. The article beneath was filled with speculation, quoting unnamed sources about a growing closeness between employer and staff. At the bottom, there was a grainy image clearly taken from inside the mansion, a still from a hallway security camera showing her and Richard talking near the piano the night before. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Someone had planted it. Someone inside. A knock came at her door. When she opened it, Evelyn stood there, phone in hand. "You've seen it?" Amara swallowed. "You did this." Evelyn's smile was all teeth. "Careful what you accuse people of. The press can be unpredictable." "Why?" Amara's voice shook. "What did I ever do to you?" Evelyn's eyes gleamed. "You exist, and you make people forget their place. That's dangerous." She leaned closer. "Take my advice. Go quietly. Leave before this becomes ugly." Amara met her gaze. "It already has." She closed the door on her, locking it. For the first time in years, her hands trembled too badly to sign. Downstairs, she could hear voices. Richard's low and angry, Evelyn's calm and cutting. Then silence. When Amara finally fell asleep near dawn, the article had spread to every gossip site, her name trending beside his. The internet was ruthless, dissecting every photo, every expression. She's manipulating him. He's saving her. Black Cinderella meets Deaf Queen. At breakfast, the staff avoided her eyes. Richard wasn't there. Helen, however, was. She reached across the table and squeezed Amara's hand gently, her eyes full of worry. "Don't run." She signed. "Let truth stand." It always does. Amara nodded, but inside she wasn't sure she believed it. Because truth didn't trend, lies did. And somewhere in this beautiful, fragile house, someone had just learned how to weaponize silence itself. The night of the gala arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. The mansion had been transformed into a glowing cathedral of glass and gold, the kind of place where every smile was rehearsed and every conversation measured in dollars. Amara stood in front of the mirror in her room, smoothing the deep green gown Helen had insisted she wear. It fit perfectly, though it felt like borrowed skin. Around her neck lay a necklace, diamonds sharp and cold against her collarbone. It had been a gift from Richard earlier that evening. He'd handed it to her without warning, the box heavy in his hand. "You've earned this," he'd said. She hadn't known how to respond, only murmured a thank you while something uneasy bloomed in her chest. Downstairs, the music had already begun, a string quartet playing a melody so elegant it almost drowned out the murmurs of gossip. The city's elite flowed through the ballroom like a current, shimmering gowns, black suits, cameras flashing. When Helen entered on Richard's arm, a hush rippled through the crowd. She looked radiant, poised, graceful, utterly alive. Amara followed a few steps behind, ready to interpret when needed. Reporters circled like hawks, drawn to the story that had taken over the internet for days. The billionaire, his deaf wife, and the mysterious black interpreter. Some headlines had been cruel, others curious, but all had done their job. Every seat was filled, every lens aimed. Evelyn was everywhere, orchestrating it all, her smile bright enough to burn. "Mrs. Ward, this way, please," she said, her tone honey-sweet but her eyes sharp. "Let's give them a moment for photos." Amara, stand beside her. "Yes, that's perfect. The contrast is stunning." Amara felt the words like a slap. The contrast. She knew exactly what Evelyn meant. Still, she stood where she was told, smiling just enough for the cameras. Helen's hand found hers and squeezed, grounding her. "Breathe," she signed discreetly. When the speeches began, Amara took her place beside Helen at the podium. Richard spoke first, his voice smooth, practiced. "Tonight is about giving voice to those who've been unheard," he said, glancing toward his wife. "And none embody that spirit more than Helen." The applause was thunderous. Amara translated his words into graceful motions for Helen, who smiled and responded with a short speech in sign language that Amara then voiced aloud for the crowd. It was simple, powerful, about silence, strength, and gratitude. For a moment, the ballroom felt suspended in something genuine. Then came the mistake. As the applause faded, Richard turned to Amara, gesturing for her to stay beside him. "And," he said, reaching into his pocket, "tonight I'd like to recognize someone else." He lifted her hand for the cameras to see. "This woman has given my wife her voice back. She reminds us that compassion, not privilege, bridges the distance between people. Please join me in thanking her." The photographers erupted. The flashes were blinding. Evelyn, standing at the back, smiled like a wolf. Richard unclasped the diamond necklace from his pocket and, God help her, placed it around Amara's neck himself. The crowd gasped. Laughter, murmurs, whispers rippled like wind across a field. Someone called out, "A gift of gratitude," or something more. A reporter chuckled. Another whispered too loudly, "Guess charity work pays well these days." Amara froze. Every eye in the room was on her. Helen's smile faltered. Evelyn leaned close to a nearby journalist, whispering something that made him grin. When the speech ended, Amara slipped away, her hands trembling. In the powder room mirror, she barely recognized herself. The jewels sparkled cruelly against her brown skin. A prop, she thought. I've become a prop in their story. The door opened. Richard stood there alone. "You disappeared," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" She turned, her voice tight. "You shouldn't have done that." "What? The necklace?" "The performance," she said. "The display. You turned kindness into spectacle." He frowned. "That wasn't my intent." "Intent doesn't erase impact," she snapped. "You wanted to show gratitude. You showed ownership." Richard's expression darkened, confusion giving way to irritation. "You're reading too much into it. I was thanking you." "Then say thank you. Don't brand me like one of your acquisitions." His jaw tightened. "Be careful, Miss Johnson. You're treading close to ungrateful." Her laugh was sharp, almost a sob. "Ungrateful? You think because I'm not bowing, I should be grateful to exist in your orbit?" For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, in a voice cold and measured, he said, "I don't know what Evelyn was right about. You've changed since you got here. You enjoy the attention." Her heart dropped. "Excuse me?" He stepped closer. "I read the articles, the comments, maybe this whole thing." He gestured between them, the air trembling with unspoken accusation. "Maybe you saw an opportunity." Her breath caught. "Is that what you think of me?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Amara unclasped the necklace, sat her hands steady despite the shaking inside. She placed it on the marble counter between them. "You can keep it," she said softly. "You can keep all of it." When she walked out, the orchestra was playing again. Couples danced beneath chandeliers, laughter spilling like champagne. Evelyn stood by the bar, watching her leave with satisfaction barely hidden. Helen saw her from across the room, panic flashing in her eyes. She signed frantically, "Amara, what's wrong?" But Amara couldn't stop. She walked straight past the flashing cameras, the valet, the night air slicing through her like judgment. She didn't remember calling a cab, only the feeling of the city lights blurring through tears. Back at her small apartment in Queens, the stillness felt like a different kind of quiet, familiar, forgiving, empty. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Richard stood near the balcony, the necklace still lying where she'd left it. Evelyn approached, her voice dripping false concern. "You did what you had to, Richard. It was getting messy." He said nothing. Helen's furious gestures caught his attention from across the room, but he couldn't understand them. Not anymore. Not without Amara. Later, when the guests were gone and the house had fallen into uneasy silence, Helen wrote on a notepad and left on Richard's desk. The ink pressed hard into the paper, the words shaking but clear. "You silenced the only person who listened." When he found it, hours later, the ink had dried, but the wound it opened had just begun to bleed. The mansion felt emptier without her, though nothing inside it had changed. The same polished marble floors reflected the same perfect light. The same orchids lined the solarium windows, but now the silence wasn't peace. It was punishment. For 2 days, Helen hadn't spoken a single word to Richard. She hadn't signed, hadn't written notes, hadn't even met his eyes. Her world had gone still again, and this time it was deliberate. He tried at first. He'd knock on her door in the morning, leave coffee outside, linger in the hall as if her silence might break if he waited long enough. But she refused to come out, except to sit in the solarium, her back straight and her expression carved from stone. When she finally did write something, she left it on the breakfast table where he couldn't miss it. You sent her away. The first person who made me feel seen in years, and you drove her off. He read it more than once. Each time, the words cut deeper. Richard spent the next days at the office, though he didn't remember most of what he did there. He signed papers, nodded at presentations, but every face he saw blurred into Amara's for a fraction of a second. The look she gave him right before walking out, that mix of heartbreak and defiance. It lingered like an echo. By Thursday, he couldn't stand the silence any longer. He returned home early and found Evelyn waiting in the library, as if she'd known he would. She poured whiskey for him before he even spoke. "You look awful," she said lightly, handing him the glass. "I made a mistake," he said after a pause. Evelyn's brow arched. "You made a lot of those lately. Care to be specific?" "Amara." The name felt strange in his mouth, too fragile for the air around Evelyn. "I accused her of something she didn't do." Evelyn's expression softened just enough to seem sympathetic. "Richard, that woman was a liability. You saw how the media twisted everything. If she'd stayed, it would have destroyed your reputation and the foundations. I protected you." He set the glass down harder than he meant to. "You destroyed her reputation to save mine. That's not protection." She gave a small, careful smile. "Sometimes we have to let the fire burn out on its own. It's cleaner that way." He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him shifted. For years, Evelyn had been his constant, efficient, loyal, calculating. But now her calm precision looked less like control and more like rot dressed in silk. "I want the truth," he said quietly. "How did that article happen? Who sent those photos to the press?" She didn't flinch. "We both know leaks happen. Maybe she shared something she shouldn't have. Maybe she wanted attention." His voice hardened. "You didn't answer my question." Evelyn's eyes cooled. "Careful, Richard. Don't start imagining conspiracies just because your charity project went wrong." He turned away from her, but his mind was already racing. The footage that surfaced online, angles from inside the house, taken from security cameras, cameras only Evelyn's department controlled. That night, he went into his study and pulled up the internal server, scrolling through weeks of archived footage. Most files had been cleared, but one folder had been overlooked. Miscellaneous backups. He opened it and found logs of deleted exports, all bearing Evelyn's credentials. The dates matched the timing of the leak. His stomach dropped. The next morning, Helen still wouldn't look at him. He placed a note on her breakfast tray. "You were right. Something's wrong here. I'll fix it." She didn't reply, but when he glanced at her later from the hallway, he caught the faintest shift in her eyes, a flicker of hope, or maybe disbelief. He spent the rest of the day calling auditors, quietly requesting internal reports on every foundation account Evelyn had managed in the last 5 years. When the CFO hesitated, he reminded him who signed his checks. "Every transaction," he said. "No summaries, no filters." That night, he sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of paper, numbers and names and red flags. Something didn't add up. One charity in particular stood out, the Bronx Hearing Center. Their funding had dropped by nearly half, though the official reports claimed donations were reallocated. He remembered Helen arguing about that program weeks ago, signing furiously at a luncheon, asking where the money had gone. Evelyn had brushed her off with corporate jargon. Now he saw the truth. Money was missing, diverted through shell accounts tied to a company Evelyn herself had founded. He traced it 3 layers deep before realizing what it meant. The articles, the rumors, Amara's humiliation, it was all a smokescreen. Evelyn had needed to remove the one person who might have noticed the inconsistencies. He sat there, hands clenched, heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years, rage. The door opened quietly behind him. Helen stood there, pale in her robe, holding one of his notes. She stepped closer, eyes searching his face. "You found something," she signed. He nodded. "Evelyn's been stealing from the foundation, using your name to cover it." Helen's face tightened, her hands trembling as she signed. "I told you she was wrong about the Bronx school. You didn't listen." "I know," he said softly. "I should have." She looked at him for a long moment, then wrote on a scrap of paper. "So what will you do?" "End it," he said, completely. The next morning, he called Evelyn into his office. She came in confident, her heels clicking, perfume sharp as ever. "You wanted to see me?" He slid the documents across the desk. "Explain these." She glanced at them briefly, then smiled. "You've been busy." I trusted you. You still can, she said smoothly. This can disappear. A few signatures, a quiet reshuffle. The press doesn't have to know. He stood, his voice low but firm. You don't understand, Evelyn. I'm not covering for you. Her smile faltered. You're making a mistake. If you fire me, I'll tell them everything about your affair. There was no affair, he snapped. Her tone turned cold. They don't need proof. They just need a story. He stared at her for a long, quiet moment. You're right. They'll have one. About the executive who stole millions from deaf children's programs. Her face blanched. You wouldn't. I already did. Security escorted her out 20 minutes later. She didn't struggle, didn't shout. But as she passed him, she leaned in close and whispered, You think this makes you clean? You'll still be the man who broke her. After she was gone, the silence in the mansion changed again. It wasn't peaceful yet, but it was lighter, like the air after thunder. That night, Richard found Helen sitting in the solarium. She looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. What about Amara? She signed. He hesitated. I don't know if she'd ever forgive me. Helen shook her head. You don't ask for forgiveness. You earn it. For the first time in years, he took her hands and signed back, clumsy but sincere. I'll try. Helen smiled faintly. Then start with the truth. When she went to bed, Richard sat alone, staring at the reflection of the ocean in the glass. Somewhere across that city, Amara was rebuilding her life, while he stood among the ruins of his own. But he wasn't done yet. Not until she knew everything. Not until she could see him for what he finally was. Not a savior, not a billionaire, not a man of power, but just a flawed soul trying too late to listen. It took only 2 weeks for the investigation to confirm what Richard already knew. Every account Evelyn had touched bled fraud. The reports arrived in thick envelopes stamped confidential, but their contents were anything but silent. There it was. Proof that millions meant for deaf children, veterans, and underfunded schools had been siphoned off through shell foundations Evelyn had built in his name. Every dollar stolen carried Helen's signature on paper she couldn't read, and his own in blind trust. The magnitude of it hit him in waves. It wasn't just betrayal, it was desecration. He had built a life on control, on seeing every threat before it reached him, yet somehow he had missed the one closest at hand. He barely slept. Every room in the mansion reminded him of what he'd ignored, the empty places at the dinner table, the corners where laughter should have lived. Helen moved through the house like a ghost again, but not because of grief this time, because she was waiting, watching to see if he'd actually do what he promised. On the third morning, he called his attorney, his CFO, and 2 federal investigators to the office. The conference room was glass-walled, the sky behind them a sheet of gray. When he dropped the folders on the table, the sound made them all flinch. I want this turned over to the authorities immediately, he said. Every cent traced, every name exposed. Evelyn Gray is to be prosecuted for embezzlement, fraud, and misrepresentation. The attorney cleared his throat. Richard, if you do this publicly, the foundation will lose its reputation? Richard cut in. Good. Maybe it'll earn an honest one. That shut the room up. For the first time in years, he wasn't speaking like a man protecting an empire. He sounded like a man tearing it down piece by piece just to see what was left underneath. That night, after the last call, he stood by the window with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. Helen appeared behind him, the soft tap of her cane against the wood floor the only sound. She handed him a folded sheet of paper. Did you tell them everything? It read. Yes, he said aloud, though she couldn't hear. When she raised her brows, he signed clumsily. Yes, all of it. She studied him, then wrote again. And what will you tell her? He stared at the question for a long time. Amara's name had lived in his mind like a bruise that never healed. He'd rehearsed apologies 1,000 times, but none seemed large enough. I don't know what she'd want to hear, he said softly. Helen wrote one more line before leaving him alone. The truth. Start there. The next morning, Richard drove himself to Queens. No driver, no assistant, no armor. The neighborhoods changed as he went, the manicured lawns giving way to small shops and narrow streets. He parked outside a brick bakery on the corner, the one whose pastries his driver used to bring Amara every morning. The air smelled of coffee and sugar, the kind of scent that could make even regret feel human. Inside, an older woman behind the counter recognized him instantly. Her eyes widened, but her voice stayed level. Mr. Ward, didn't expect to see your kind here without a camera crew. He almost smiled. I'm looking for someone. Amara Johnson? She still lives nearby? The woman's expression softened, suspicion turning to something gentler. She's a good girl. Volunteers at the community school most mornings, helps kids who can't hear. She doesn't talk much about you, though. He nodded, staring at the floor. That's fair. The woman poured him a cup of coffee, unasked. You hurt her bad, Mr. Ward. Not just her pride, her faith. She believed she could make a difference. Then the world told her she was just another story for people to consume. I know, he said quietly. I intend to fix that. Can't fix what you broke, the woman said. But you can build something better beside the pieces. He left the cup half full and drove to the Bronx Hearing Center, the same charity Evelyn had stolen from. The building was worn, paint peeling from the window frames, but there was laughter inside, high, clear, unguarded. Through the glass doors, he saw Amara sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of children, teaching them to sign the alphabet. Her hands moved quickly, gracefully, her eyes bright with joy. For a moment he couldn't move. The sight of her like that, free, unguarded, made the air leave his lungs. When she finally noticed him standing in the doorway, the joy drained from her face. The children followed her gaze, then scattered, leaving a hush that settled heavy between them. Mr. Ward, she said flatly, you shouldn't be here. He nodded. You're right. She stood, crossing her arms. Then why are you? I came to tell you the truth, he said, about everything. Her expression didn't soften. You think I care about your truth? I think you deserve to know it. He told her about Evelyn, about the fraud, about the stolen money and the lies she'd woven to protect herself. He told her how he believed them because it was easier than believing in her. The words tumbled out raw, unpolished, but real. When he finished, Amara said nothing. She turned away, looking out the window at the playground where the kids were now signing to each other, their laughter soundless but alive. You think this changes what you did to me? She asked finally. You humiliated me in front of everyone I tried to help. You made me doubt my worth, my dignity, my reason for being here. That doesn't just disappear because you finally decided to grow a conscience. He took a step closer. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I was wrong. Her voice broke slightly as she said, Then why does it sound like you're still trying to make it about you? The words hit harder than he expected. He looked down, ashamed. You're right, he murmured. It's not about me anymore. It's about fixing what I let happen. He reached into his coat and placed a single folder on the table between them. This is the full audit. Every dollar that was stolen is being returned. The schools will be refunded, and Evelyn Gray will face charges. Amara glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. You think justice is paperwork? No, he said. Justice is giving back what was taken. Dignity, voice, the right to be heard. That's why I came here, not to clear my name, but to start listening. For the first time, she met his eyes. There was no forgiveness there, but there was something else, understanding maybe, or the faintest spark of belief that he might mean what he said. You want to help? She asked quietly. Then help them. She gestured toward the kids outside. Help them have what no one ever gave me, a place that doesn't treat silence like a disability. He nodded slowly. Then that's what I'll do. She didn't ask him to stay. She turned back to the children, her hands moving again, teaching them how to spell hope with their fingers. He watched for a long time before leaving, like the sound of their laughter following him to the car, even though none of it reached his ears. That night, back at the mansion, he found Helen waiting with her notepad. She had written only one sentence. Did she listen? He signed clumsily. She didn't need to. I did. Helen smiled faintly, her hands replying, Then maybe you're finally learning to hear. Outside, the ocean roared against the cliffs, the same endless rhythm that had always been there. But this time, for the first time in years, it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like something alive, something waiting to be answered. 2 weeks later, the Bronx Hearing Center buzzed with excitement. It was a gray morning, the kind that smelled of rain and possibility, and the children had been whispering about the mysterious guest who was coming to visit. Amara stood by the doorway of the gym, adjusting the chairs for the afternoon assembly. She'd been volunteering here almost every day since she left the Ward mansion. The work was steady, honest. It reminded her that life still had corners untouched by greed or gossip. She moved from one child to another, helping them line up, making sure each one's hands were clean, their faces bright. When the first black SUV pulled up outside, she thought it was another delivery for the school. But then a familiar tall figure stepped out, dressed simply in a dark sweater and trousers. Richard Ward looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. The arrogance she remembered had melted into something quieter, humbler. He paused before entering, taking in the laughter of the children through the open doors. Amara's heart froze, then sped up. She turned away quickly, pretending to check the stage setup. But he saw her, and for a moment the noise of the world seemed to fade. "Miss Johnson," he said softly when he reached her. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath, like a man standing in the ruins of what he'd built. "Mr. Ward," she said without turning, "this is a public school. Anyone can visit." "I didn't come to visit," he said. "I came to make things right." She looked at him then, ready to cut him down with every word he deserved. But before she could speak, he lifted his hands. Slowly, awkwardly, his fingers began to move. "I was wrong." The signs were hesitant, almost childlike, but unmistakable. He kept going. "I hurt you, and my wife. I am sorry." Amara stared, her lips parting in disbelief. His hands shook, his movements clumsy, but his eyes, those storm gray eyes that once looked at her with suspicion, now burned with sincerity. "Who taught you?" she whispered. "Helen," he said aloud. "She said if I couldn't say it the way you would understand, then I hadn't said it at all." Her throat tightened. Around them, the children had gone quiet, sensing something rare unfolding. Richard's next words came out in a rough whisper. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I can start by giving back what Evelyn stole. The money's been returned to every school, every family, and there's more." He looked toward the stage, where the principal and a few teachers stood, watching curiously. "Today, I'm establishing the Amara Foundation for Black Deaf Youth. It'll fund programs like this across the country. The first grant is for this school." The room seemed to stop breathing. The principal clapped a hand over her mouth. The children, not understanding the words but sensing the weight of them, smiled when Amara smiled, though she didn't realize she was. She shook her head, voice trembling. "You don't have to." "I know," he said gently. "That's why I should." Miss Albright, the principal, approached with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Ward, that's incredible." She turned to Amara, her face glowing. "He wants to name the scholarship after your brother, the Malik Johnson Grant for deaf veterans and their families." Amara's knees nearly gave out. She reached for the edge of a chair to steady herself. "Malik?" she whispered. Richard nodded. "I remembered what you told Helen about him, about how the world stopped listening to him when the war ended. No one should have to fight to be heard." The children began to clap, a flurry of soundless joy. Amara covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears that came anyway. Richard didn't move closer. He just stood there, letting the noise and emotion wash over him, humbled. When the applause faded, he spoke again, quieter. "You told me once that I buy respect instead of earning it. You were right, but I want to spend the rest of my life earning it from people like you." Amara took a long breath, her chest rising and falling as if she were trying to make space for forgiveness that hadn't yet arrived. "You did a terrible thing," she said softly. "You believed the worst in me because it was easier than seeing me as your equal." "I know," he said. "I was raised to see the world in pieces, people who have power and people who don't. You broke that for me." The quiet stretched between them again, not heavy this time, but tender, alive. Amara looked around at the children signing excitedly, at the teachers wiping their eyes, and then back at him. "You've given them hope," she said. He smiled faintly. "No, you did that. I'm just late to the lesson." Miss Albright stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone, her voice trembling with emotion. "Students, we are honored today to welcome Mr. Richard Ward, whose foundation has just donated funds to build our new art and technology wing and to establish the Malik Johnson Grant for deaf youth across the nation." The crowd erupted in cheers. Richard glanced at Amara, then back at the children, his voice low but clear. "This isn't a gift," he said. "It's a debt long overdue. When the ceremony ended, the children surrounded Amara, hugging her waist, tugging at her sleeves, signing excitedly that she was famous now. She laughed, but her eyes kept finding Richard across the room. Helen wasn't there, but somehow her presence filled the space between them, a quiet grace that had begun this entire story. As the crowd dispersed, Richard walked toward her once more, stopping a respectful distance away. "I meant what I said before," he murmured. "If you ever want to be part of the Foundation's leadership, it's yours. You don't have to answer now." She studied him, seeing the fatigue in his eyes, the humility in his posture. He looked nothing like the man who had humiliated her in that ballroom. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you know what it means to be unheard," he said simply, "and because you never stopped listening." She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hands and signed slowly, deliberately, so he could understand. "You've learned to hear. Now learn to stay quiet long enough to keep hearing." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I will." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the soundless laughter of children and the hum of a city that, for once, seemed to listen. When he finally turned to leave, Amara watched him go, not as an enemy or even as a man seeking forgiveness, but as someone who had finally stepped out of the noise and into understanding. Outside, the rain began to fall, light, cleansing, unhurried. Richard tilted his face to it, closing his eyes. Somewhere behind him, inside the school, Amara began teaching again, her hands moving gracefully in the language that had saved them both. A full year passed before Amara saw Richard and Helen again. In that time, the Foundation had grown from an idea into something tangible, a network of schools and programs for deaf children across the country, each one carrying a piece of the woman who had inspired it. The Bronx Hearing Center had become the pilot site for a new initiative, and the media called it a revolution in accessible education. But for Amara, it was more personal. It was the proof that silence, when understood, could build something louder than any voice. That morning, the city woke to spring sunlight and the smell of new paint. The grand opening of the Malik Johnson Center for Deaf Veterans was hours away, and Amara walked through the polished halls one last time before the ceremony began. Photographs lined the walls, images of children signing their first words, soldiers learning to communicate with their families again, mothers and sons smiling without fear of misunderstanding. It was everything she had once dreamed of, even when she hadn't dared to dream it aloud. She wore a simple cream dress, her hair pinned back, her hands free. Reporters had been asking all week if she was nervous about the event, but she wasn't. She'd already lived through the hard part. This was the quiet after the storm, the kind that didn't demand attention but deserved it. Outside, the crowd began to gather, veterans, families, teachers, students, and donors. There were banners bearing the Foundation's logo, but her name wasn't on any of them. That had been deliberate. Amara wanted the spotlight on the community, not the woman who had once been at the center of a scandal. Still, she knew the press would turn up for one reason: the wards were attending. When the black car pulled up to the curb, the murmurs started. Helen stepped out first, wearing a pale blue coat and a smile that reached her eyes. Her hair was shorter now, silver shining in the sun. Richard followed, looking older but lighter, his face softer, unguarded. He carried no entourage, no wall of cameras behind him, just himself, for once, in the open. Amara walked toward them, her heart steady but her hands trembling just slightly. Helen greeted her first, signing Go World. "You've built something beautiful." Amara smiled. "We did, together." Helen squeezed her hand, then turned toward the entrance, leaving the two of them alone for a moment. Richard looked around, taking in the courtyard where children were already practicing sign language under a canopy of flags. "It's more than I imagined," he said quietly. "You turned an apology into a movement." Amara shook her head. "You turned guilt into action. I just showed you where to start." He smiled faintly. "You were always better at giving direction." They stood in silence for a few moments, not awkwardly, but comfortably, like people who finally understood the language of quiet. When the crowd was ushered inside, the ceremony began. The mayor gave a speech. The principal shared statistics, and then it was Amara's turn to speak. She walked to the podium, took a slow breath, and looked out at the sea of faces. Her voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the cadence of someone who had learned to measure each word. A year ago, she began, this was just an idea, a dream built out of frustration, compassion, and a little bit of stubbornness. I thought if we could teach people to listen with their eyes and speak with their hearts, we might change a few lives. I was wrong. We've changed thousands. Applause rippled through the hall. She waited for it to fade before continuing. My brother Malik used to say that silence was the hardest part of coming home from war. Not the injuries, not the memories, but the quiet. He said silence can swallow you if no one reaches in to pull you out. This place is for him and for every person who ever felt unheard. She signed the last sentence as she spoke it, her fingers moving fluidly. Many in the audience signed back. Veterans, children, families. It was the kind of chorus that didn't need sound to fill a room. When she stepped down, Helen embraced her tightly. Richard waited nearby, clapping slowly, pride softening his features. You were extraordinary, he said when she approached. So were you, she replied. Most men in your position would have vanished after what happened. You stayed. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I stayed because I needed to understand what you meant that night, about kindness and earning respect. You were right, Amara. Money buys influence, but kindness changes history. She studied him for a long moment. The man before her wasn't the cold executive who had once accused her of deceit. He was different now, humbled, human, almost fragile in his sincerity. You finally learned to listen, she said softly. He smiled, eyes glinting. From the best teacher I ever had. Helen joined them again, looping her arm through Richard's. She signed to both of them. Come see the children's performance. In the courtyard, a group of students stood in a semicircle, each holding small American flags. Music began to play from hidden speakers, soft piano, low and steady, and the children began to sign the lyrics of America the Beautiful. Their hands moved in perfect rhythm, translating every word into light. Some were missing fingers, some had trembling hands. All of them were beautiful. Helen wept openly. Richard reached for her hand, and when he looked at Amara, his expression said everything words never could. She smiled back, her heart full, not with victory or vindication, but peace. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began to thin, Amara found herself standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching the children chase each other through the sunlight. Helen sat nearby, talking with parents, while Richard stood under a tree, gazing at the school's new sign gleaming in the afternoon light. He turned when he saw her. You're not staying for the press interviews? She shook her head. They don't need me for that. This belongs to them now. He stepped closer, his tone softer. I meant what I said earlier. The foundation could use someone like you in leadership. I already have a job, she said, smiling. These kids are my bosses. He laughed quietly. I suppose they're tougher than the board of directors. Much, she said. They stood together for another minute, letting the warmth settle. Goodbye, Richard, she said finally. Goodbye, Amara. He hesitated. And thank you for everything. She looked at him, sunlight catching in her eyes. You don't have to thank me. Just keep listening. He nodded once, then walked back toward Helen. Amara watched them go. The billionaire and his wife, hands entwined, walking through the laughter of children who had never learned to feel small. It was a picture of redemption, imperfect but true. As the sun dipped low, she turned toward the playground where a group of students were signing to each other, their gestures bold and full of joy. One boy tugged at her sleeve and asked, "What does kindness mean?" Amara knelt beside him, her smile gentle. Kindness, she signed, means seeing someone before the world does. He grinned, repeating the motion until he got it right. Around them, the other children joined in, their hands forming the same sign, their faces bright with understanding. When Amara finally looked up, the sky was streaked with gold and violet, the kind of colors that fade slowly, as if unwilling to leave. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter, hers, theirs, everyone's, blending into something whole. And in that moment, beneath a sky that no longer felt too big, Amara understood that her story wasn't about pain or justice or even forgiveness. It was about the quiet power of being heard at last. She lifted her hands toward the sky and signed a single word, the one that had started it all. Listen.